Good day to you. If I was to ask you what kind of power you have when you go on social media, how would you answer that question? Can you jump on Twitter right now and make somebody laugh? Can you make somebody laugh because you have power? Power because of your credibility as a jokester? Can you get somebody to laugh on Twitter or Snapchat or Instagram or Facebook? What about putting two people back together who are in a fight? Could you do that? Do you have the power to do that on social media if you jump on and send a message to both people at the same time, trying to get them back to you? Do you have that kind of power? What about parking at East Stroudsburg University? Are you upset about the parking situation? If you wanted to make a change in parking policy, could you get on social media? Could you tweet at the president? Would that have an impact? Yeah, those are the questions that we're asking to start off today's instructor video. We're asking questions about power as we continue our critical theoretical advance in studying social media use. We've been studying social media use by building a body of critical theory first. And then yesterday we considered the question of what makes media social and what makes social media social. The word is, after all, in the title. We're still asking that question. What makes social media social? It's a long question that needs to be answered by the field of sociology and sociological theory. And that is, in fact, what we're taking on today. We're taking on sociological theory, which helps us to understand the next dimension of media that we want to take a look at, social media, and that is power. That power dimension, and where is the power on social media in all the people who are using social media, the consumers like us, the companies, the advertisers, and the social media companies themselves, the people who are using social media to make money. Where does the power reside, and is that power real or is it imagined? And just like in the last chapter, we had a takedown of an author who had thoughts in the areas that this author, Christian Fuchs, wants to address in a category of information such as power. Today, he takes on Manuel Castells. Manuel Castells has a trilogy of books. He's a professor from the University of Barcelona. He's got a trilogy of books that deal with communication and power and the concept of power. And he writes very much about social media. And once again, Fuchs sets up this rosy scenario that's painted by a researcher as not really being the full story when you look at social media. So the rosy scenario is set up by saying that Manuel Castells says that social media communication is mass self-communication. It's mass self-communication. Again, in the old days, before social media, before the internet, when we had mass communication in the form of television, radio, newspapers, magazines, and films, you had basically one source. It could be a film production company, it could be NBC, a television network, it could be a Pocono Record newspaper, sending out information mostly one direction to masses of people. There was not that kind of two-way interaction between newspaper readers and the producer, or between the television audience and the producers. That has changed in the way that form of communication has been transformed by social media, because now the content can be produced by a single individual, by the self. Even the selfie embodies the photograph of the self, embodies the self-creation of content, which is then mass communicated because it's put onto these networks that then are interconnected with each other. Twitter talks to Facebook sometimes, Facebook talks to Instagram, and Snapchat is kind of on its own, but the internet connects everything together. So social media communication is presented as this great thing because it is a mass self-communication. People have the power. They have the power to get to others because of mass self-communication possibilities. And that this represents a profound shift in society and represents a realization of possibilities to make changes for the good. That's what Castells is talking about. And so now Christian Fuchs takes Castells and he says, what you are not doing is considering social theory. That is what is missing from your analysis of all the great things about the internet and the way that people as individuals have more power now. That what is missing is social theory. So what is social theory? Social theory, Fuchs says, endeavors to understand events and institutions and trends in society. That's what it seeks to do. It seeks to understand. And part of that involves making us aware of unrealized potential that human beings could have actuated that are not being actuated because of impediments that are in the social structure. So social theory has to always look at what human potential is not being maximized there. And that to discover the structural limitations is part of the insight that you gain when you apply social theory. For example, at ESU, we have a lot of African American students who come here, and some of them, not all of them, but some of them who have spoken to me say they come from financially distressed regions, in many cases downtown Philadelphia in the inner city, and they're coming to ESU without the awareness of how to navigate the financial system at ESU, the student loans, the grants, and how to cover textbooks. And they don't have that literacy because that has not been a prominent feature of neighborhoods in certain parts of inner cities. So there's not that financial literacy. That is what we would refer to as a structural limitation on knowledge. It's a structural limitation that comes from a background and a context. And we can say the same thing goes on. The same thing is what happens when you apply social theory. You're trying to look at how social media is used and trying to identify those impediments that get in the way of people realizing their full potential. So he has these 3 trilogy of books, Castells does, and they're all together speaking about a networked society. And the critique by Fuchs is that everything that Castells says about power is relating back to power needing to be based on coercion. That power in some sense rests with forcing somebody to be able to do something against their will. And that this is in fact many of the traditional ways of looking at power, which is defined in many ways. The author Fuchs draws on a big literature to put together this chapter, and he looks at a lot of different ways of defining power. And most of those definitions, as is the case for Castells, are based on coercion. But Fuchs, and it will take him longer to make this argument, it's not going to just happen in this chapter. Fuchs says there is another way. There is another way to exercise power that is based on love and intimacy and affection. Now, you just have to hang on to that thought. He doesn't really develop it that well in this chapter. He'll get there when we talk more about cooperation on social media, but he's saying that the only exercise of power is not necessarily based on coercion, that there is this other kind of power that's possible. It's called cooperative power. Now let's follow Fuchs as he continues with his takedown of Castells' conception of power in social media. And so the next area that Fuchs wants to go into is the problem with Castells, what he calls technocratic language, and the way that Castells describes the internet. And basically, Fuchs says the way that Castells talks about human beings is like we are computers. He says that the language used in Castells' books describes switchers and packets and program codes and nodes. This is computer language. It makes perfect sense to talk about pieces of equipment and wires and software that way, but you cannot talk about human beings exercising power through computer metaphors. Computer metaphors do not appropriately describe humans. Its society is based on humans, not on equipment. Humans are reflexive. Humans are self-conscious. Humans have feelings. Society is more than just technology. Society is about humans, and that technological networks are not social networks. A Facebook network is not necessarily a social network. Facebook, the connection through a piece of software that you log on to and then follow the rules of posting, that's not necessarily the same thing as a social network, which describes the relations between the people who are meeting up on Facebook and Snapchat and Twitter and the rest of the social media platforms. Next up is the takedown. That's the words that I use to describe the way Fuchs goes after the people that he wants to criticize. And next up is the takedown of Castells' view of mass self-communication, which Castells says is allowing for the emergence of a, quote, creative audience. A creative audience in prior past models of communication and mass communication that I described earlier, television in the 1970s, the audience had no creative input on the show. The audience sat there and watched the sitcom or the soap opera or whatever it was. You watched it. The model has changed, Castell says, by social media because now the audience is creating the content. We've been building that up, right? We are prosumers. We are producing and we are consuming at the same time, but that producing is the new part of the audience equation in the social media age, and this is a great thing. And that part of what makes this possible is that because of social media, the average person today has autonomy. That the person can go on the internet and you have your own control over what you want to do. Nobody's forcing you to type things. Nobody's telling you you can't type things. But autonomy, as Fuchs once again does, he takes a word, which is really a concept, which is really a social act because it's a fact, and he takes it and he breaks it down. He gets into it with the kind of depth that we would expect in a critical class. So he takes that idea of autonomy and he describes it as a conflict between corporate commodification and audience creativity. That the autonomy that should be there for us to be able to do whatever we want on social media and the internet in general is not there because there's a conflict. There's a conflict between the corporate commodification, all of those media platforms that we're taking part in, they're wanting to figure out a way to make money off of the content that we're putting on. They're just trying all the time. Twitter has still not found the way to make a profit, but Facebook sure has. They're trying all the time to commodify what we're doing. They're trying to get us into boxes. They're trying to get us to follow rules to track our every move. And that is in conflict with people just wanting to create. We don't want to have creativity guided by a certain select set of emojis. We don't want to have our creativity guided by how many characters you can put in a Twitter post or how many seconds you can record a Snapchat video in. These are conflicts. And again, that's what critical theory is about, right? It's dialectical in its reasoning. It's trying to find conflicts all the time. And so when you look at the internet, one of the key terms that's used is asymmetrical power. And that is at play with self-mass communication. Asymmetrical power is when something's out of balance. Power is not equal on the internet because the bigger corporations, they have more power than individuals. And there's a great quote on page 93 to bring this further into focus, this idea of power and how it plays out on the internet. And it goes like this: the media are not just a realm of symbolic power, but socio-material spaces where structures and contradictions of economic, political, coercive, and symbolic power, all different kinds of power, manifest themselves. So the social media are where all of these forms of power are not just symbolic, but it's a space of social relations where all these kinds of powers come together. Economic. You're buying the pizza, you get to choose what goes on the pizza. That's economic power. Political power. You were elected to office, you're going to take I'm department chairperson. I have a responsibility to assign a professor to a course. I choose that. That's political power I have by virtue of me being elected. Coercive power. If my son does not keep the attic clean when he has his friends over, I'm going to say that he can't use it anymore. Taking it away, that's coercive power. And symbolic power. Symbolic power is more difficult to understand. It has to do with the way that we revere or respect certain institutions. I mean, if you have a parent and your parent says to you, I really, really am going to ask you not to do that, could be symbolic because you revere that parent, you respect that parent so much. So these kinds of power are taking place all the time, every time we're creating content on the internet. And that capitalism is the context in which this is taking place, global capitalism. And capitalism, as we're starting to build a case about, is not just an economic system. It's not just supply and demand. It also is a form of society. It organizes our relations with each other. We've been building that case throughout this semester, and the way that we interact with others on social media has as its core, operating behind it, is the money profit-making extraction of data that's going on behind the scenes, and that affects the way that they are encouraged by the software to like things, right? If you do congratulations on Facebook, up comes all these automatic movements and graphics of glitter and confetti, and that word turns red automatically. It's just a tiny example of big data companies trying to bring us in, they have the power. They have the economic, the political, the cultural power, and the power is asymmetrical. And so now let's move on now to talk about the next takedown by Fuchs. And this takedown is what we're going to call, or what he calls, the stratified online sphere. The stratified online sphere. And what that's speaking to is Castell's notion that mass self-communication is no longer necessitating access control. Now let me explain what that means. Castell says that because of mass self-communication possible on social media, that access control is no longer applicable. So in the past, if you wanted to watch television, you have to pay for a cable service, or you have to pay for satellite television, and then you're going to have different levels of TV channels that you can purchase. If you want to buy a magazine, you have your choice of getting a subscription, or you have your choice of buying off of the stand. These are ways of controlling access to media. These kinds of ways of controlling are based on financial models that are no longer at play in social media, because we are willingly giving the content to the big data companies that are then selling that content to advertisers. So we don't need to pay for cable. We don't need to pay for the internet that we pay for cable. We need to pay for an internet service provider, but we don't need to pay for different levels of channel selection. There is no access control that is needed there. However, true to form, Fuchs says this is not the appropriate way to think about this, because not all information is visible to the same degree on social media. That's why we have search engine optimization as a whole strategy, because all information is not treated equally out there on the internet. There are filters that stop certain information from coming through. There are biases towards celebrities and people who are already famous as gaining the attention in the attention economy. The people, the individual citizens, you have the ability to write a book right now and put it on Amazon and sell it. You know that? But if you do that, will anybody ever find it? I've got a book on there right now, rounding some corners. I'm a professor. I have a fairly high profile, at least in the micro world of the university world. But my book is still really hard to find on there. It's just a tiny example of how Fuchs' point here is that the internet is not this equal space where every piece of information has an equal profile on it. It has hidden stuff. It's asymmetrical. And so there is a stratified online sphere. All right, now the chapter heads in a very different direction. It heads into looking at social movements to try and to determine once again whether the internet, and in specific social media, have as much power as Castells and others believe the social media have given society a transformative power. And so he looks at different movements across the world, and you may be a little bit out of your league here. Us Americans, we don't travel that much, and we don't get to, well, as a general rule, and we don't get to see far reaches of the world like where some of these movements have taken place, but you may be aware of some of them. The Arab Spring is the first one that's talked about. That's basically a revolutionary trend that happened across several Arab countries in the Middle East, but the two ones that had the biggest effects were Tunisia and Egypt, which actually had its president put in jail. And these revolutions have been called the Facebook revolution or the Twitter revolution, because people were supposedly able to organize outside of traditional media, which are controlled by government television, newspapers, keeping control on agitating content and protests. But supposedly Facebook opened up that possibility. And there are other areas that are talked about as well in this section too, is Iceland, and that there was a movement in Spain called the Spanish 15M. And then there's the Occupy Wall Street movement, which is a whole separate section in the chapter too. But all of these, Fuchs says, are based on an idea that we introduced earlier in the class that he says is a false sense of assumption. That idea is technological determinism. Technological determinism is the idea that technology can solve problems, that technology is the reason why power is equalized in society, why social justice is being advanced. It's all because of technology. But Fuchs says society is much more complex than technology, and that technology takes place in context. And if there was not a bitter uprising, a bitter feelings in Tunisia and the Middle East, the technology would not have a place in the conversation. And that in fact social media are contradictory in and of themselves. They have a fundamental contradiction that we are giving ourselves away from free, but at the same time we're not bothered by it. We're not bothered by it enough to do away with social media or to demand in a social movement that we be paid by Facebook. We're not. That's the contradiction that's going on. And because there's a contradiction every time we use social media, the effects are contradictory. So posting about marching in Strasbourg to take back the night, to protest domestic violence, including rape, is that going to have an impact? Is that going to get people out there? According to Fuchs, it does not, because the effects are contradictory. We'll go on there. We will feel like we have participated in a movement. We will like somebody else's statement about politics that we happen to agree with. But is that really changing anybody's opinion? Is that really getting out and conversing? There's an inherent contradiction that's going on there. And there was a survey that was conducted by the Fear Project. And this survey looked at different methods of communication in Egypt, and 93% of people felt that they were activated by face-to-face communication. 93%, not by social media. And plus, Fuchs says, if social media is responsible for the revolution, then why didn't it work the other way? Because the Egyptian state was using social media to try and suppress the revolution, to badmouth the protesters, to delegitimize them. Why didn't their messages work? So that's part of Fuchs' argument that social media don't have as much power in social movements. And then he also did his own study of the Occupy Wall Street movement that then later became the Occupy movement that swept across the United States about 8 years ago. And this was trying to point out it became a big collection of ideas without a big core. At least that's my view. But it involved things that basically were revolving around equality, economic equality, educational equality, not having really, 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 really ultra mega rich people, and also having people living in crack houses and having homeless people. So the Occupy movement started to occupy big cities and have peaceful protests. And Fuchs did a study of that, and he did find out that the most important methods to mobilize people, to get them to come out and camp out with the Occupy movements, the most important methods were Facebook, email, cell phone, including sending text messages, and Twitter. Those were the primary methods. So there is a panoply there, several different kinds of communication, some of which is social media. But less information was posted on alternative platforms. There was a nonprofit platform called Occupy that was set up just to distribute information. Less information was posted there because most of the mobilization that went on was through face-to-face mobilization. He's got a bunch of facts and figures there. You can look in the book yourself. You can see he's got his surveys that he used for people. It's basically picking up on the idea that social media are not as good at mobilizing people as we think. And the idea that Castells and others say about social media movements, that they are leaderless movements, and that's why they're so successful, because you don't need to have a leader, you don't need a hierarchy, you don't need to have people believing in somebody else's ego to join on, to sign up. You don't need that in social media. That's not actually true, Fuchs says. Actually, social media networks have a handful of people that are controlling the communication and serve as the symbolic figureheads of the social movement. So you do have a hierarchy, and that social media are not necessarily going to bring about automatic democracy of inequality of people's power within the structure. It's not an equalizer, social media, like you think. That's what Fuchs says. We're bringing it back to power here now, right? We're discussing whether social media enable power on the part of the average citizen, or who does have the power. And so, yeah, that's what Fuchs is arguing through this whole thing. And he says that actually there is a social movement fetishism. There's that word again, fetishism, that social movements, that they exist in the capitalist global framework,
but they can only do so much. They can only do so much because they fizzle out, they fade away, they become sects, they become cults, they become weird fringe groups, and that's a fetishism. Remember, a fetishism is when you look at a social act and treat it as a thing that cannot be changed. And that's what Fuchs says. It's not true, but what Fuchs says, and now he's revealing his true philosophical thought process, which you don't have to agree with. That's not the purpose of this. This is a class about critically analyzing media. And you have every right to critically analyze media in whatever sense, shape, or form that you want to. But the particular focal point that Fuchs is coming to with this political economy analysis of media that's taking building blocks one chapter at a time to develop here is he's asking for a democratic socialist social media, a democratic socialist social media where people own the social media, where people have equality of power, where people cooperate based on love and affection and intimacy, which is yet to be developed, in which people are cooperating and not in competition with each other to supply data to companies that are making billions of dollars at the expense of the people's free labor. It's a by now a familiar theme in this class, but there's more about it to be developed, and that's what we'll be heading to in succeeding chapters. In the meantime, have a great day.